Hi there, everyone. Mychal Bryan here from the Oraculos School of Astrology with yet another episode within our Planetary Pairs series. Within this Planetary Pairs series, I go through all of the pairs of all of the planets so that you can know how to integrate a more planetary based style of astrology into your larger astrological practice. If this is your first time joining us here on the Oraculos Podcast, this is your touchstone for concrete event based astrology here on the internet. And if you want to continue to connect with astrology like this, then please take a moment, go down below, hit the subscription button, as well as hit the notification bell so that you receive notifications of when we come out with these episodes pretty much on a daily basis. Now, we started this planetary pairs series based on the midheaven. And the reason for that is because the midheaven, from a Uranian astrology perspective and also a cosmobiology perspective, is the most sensitive point or the most important personal point that we have within our charts. So, from a Uranian perspective, we focus on the midheaven because the midheaven more specifically represents the soul and the psyche of who we are. And if you want to see and hear my entire spiel on the midheaven, I'm going to put the link down below in the description box so that you can check out the last episode of this planetary pair series so that you can learn all about the midheaven and what every planetary combination to the midheaven yields. And truthfully, that's just kind of like a drop in the bucket because we know that astrology is an inexhaustible language to describe everything that occurs within our universe. Therefore, what I said about the midheaven and the various planetary combinations with the midheaven is a very good starting place if you want to start thinking in more of a planet based way, but it definitely isn't the ending place. And the same is going to be true within this episode, in which we go through all of the planetary pairs in relation to the sun. The reason I wanted to do this is because we have a lot of signs of the zodiac based astrology in the world. We have a lot of aspect patterns based astrology in the world. You could have a reading and someone can talk to you about how your chart looks like a bucket versus a kite versus a flag versus the finger of God. And so there are all of these ways of working with astrology that we have in the world that are meant to streamline our astrological process and that are also meant to make astrology somewhat easier. Because when it comes to talking about aspect patterns, for example, a lot of people find it far easier to talk about what it means to have God's middle finger in your chart as opposed to talking about the aspects that make up that aspect pattern. For example, within the finger of God situation, that's composed of two quincunxes and a sextile. And whereas we do have a lot of astrological literature that exists today regarding how to interpret that planetary configuration, that never existed before. Because previously, astrologers would focus on deconstructing aspects based on the actual planets within that aspect, as opposed to some larger shape or pattern that those aspects actually made. And I believe that within a world where we have a lot of that type of astrology, where we do talk about the aspect patterns and we do talk about the shape of the chart, whether it's a splash versus a centipede versus whatever, I think it's more important at this point within our astrological development to be able to have far more nuanced conversations and to be able to have far more nuanced information about what it means for two planets to come together to form a dialogue between each other. So, this idea of planet to planet based astrology is really the most important movement in our astrological community at the moment. And truthfully, we have a lot going on within the traditional astrology world. We have a lot going on within the evolutionary astrology world. We have a lot going on within the psychological astrology world. But what we don't specifically see happening amongst all of those schools of astrology is this re emphasis on planets and the conversations that planets have together. Now, within the 20th century, where we saw this happening the strongest was in the schools of Uranian astrology and the Uranian astrology knockoff, which is cosmobiology. Now, if anybody has listened to me for longer than one video, you know that I absolutely love cosmobiology. A big part of why I love cosmobiology is because I love the word cosmobiology. And I think that the cosmobiologists who arose out of Germany and who created that system of astrology out of Germany, they were very skillful in terms of repackaging astrology under this title of cosmobiology. I think it's a brilliant name, and I don't know. I've thought about what I would call a physical school for Oraculos if I were to establish it in the flesh. And I've bounced around with the idea of the Cosmobiology Institute of Greater Boston once or twice, but the reality is that I think that even though it's a wonderful name, it could be a little bit confusing, especially because we have so much momentum already built around the word astrology that we don't necessarily need to try to reinvent the wheel and create a cosmobiology out of it. We just need to repackage the astrology that we practice so that it can be more credible and so that it can have more gravitas within the world in general. But the point of all of this is that the schools of Uranian astrology and the knockoff cosmobiology, and when I say the knockoff cosmobiology, I don't say that to be disrespectful, but cosmobiology is genuinely a knockoff of Uranian astrology. And when you read the cosmobiology book, The Combinations of Stellar Influences, it literally says that we are a knockoff of Uranian astrology to a very large degree. Because what we find in cosmobiology is Uranian astrology light. So, cosmobiology really focuses on using the 90-degree dial, which is a structure that we find in Uranian astrology, and it also focuses on using the midpoints between the planets, which is a concept that we first found being hashed out fully within Uranian astrology. The difference between cosmobiology and Uranian astrology largely is that whereas cosmobiology tends to take this more simplistic approach in terms of the planetary relationships, in Uranian astrology we find a much vaster set of relationships that can occur between planets and a much vaster set of hard aspect possibilities that can occur between planets. What we also find in Uranian astrology is that we're not just using the 90-degree dial, which is what cosmobiologists tend to use, but we're also using the 360-degree dial as well as an interpretive tool within our larger astrological toolkit. And finally, and not necessarily finally, but for our purposes right now, the other major innovation that we find occurring within Uranian astrology is the use of the 8 trans-Neptunian planets of Cupido, Hades, Zeus, Kronos, Apollon, Admetos, Vulcanus, and Poseidon. Now, if you know nothing about the trans-Neptunian planets, I've recently begun introducing them within our larger weekly astrology report because I feel as if people need to know about them. Also, because the trans-Neptunian planets, they carry a lot of weight, especially within the context of mundane astrology. One thing that's recently happened is that for the last weeks of October, I was predicting, using the trans-Neptunian planets, the likelihood of a volcanic eruption or the likelihood of volcanic activity that catches the world by storm. And what we find going on at the moment is that there is a volcano that is erupting in Japan, and it was a volcano that nobody knew about because it was an underwater volcano, and that volcano is apparently still erupting and currently creating a new island in Japan. We've also heard of recent volcanic activity in Iceland as well. These things and these predictions would not have been possible if it weren't for my use of the trans-Neptunian planet, because I predicted those things based on Sun-Vulcanus combinations, also based on Mars-Vulcanus combinations. So I personally am someone who believes that the proof is in the pudding, and as far as the transnaps are concerned, the proof is definitely in the pudding in terms of the way how they manifest concrete events within our world at large. And ultimately, while I'm deeply rooted in traditional astrology as a concept as well, I'm also deeply rooted in astrology that works. And if I have access to tools that allow me to practice more accurate, more concrete, and more prediction oriented astrology in the world, within reason, I'm going to use those tools because I think collectively as an astrological community, we really care about being right. Because there's a lot of astrology in the world right now that's quite wrong and inaccurate. So, as astrologers moving towards futurity together, we really need to establish this piece within ourselves that is dedicated to practicing astrology that is more accurate, that is more concrete, that is more prediction oriented, and that actually holds true within the lives of people. Now, that was a rather long spiel to tell you about an upcoming event that we have happening at the Oraculos School of Astrology this coming January 2024, which is our Uranian Astrology for Practicing Astrologers Intensive. So, if you want to practice more concrete, accurate, event oriented astrology within your astrological practice. And if you want to give more powerful readings that both you and your clients can truly rely on, then by all means sign up for our upcoming Uranian Astrology for Practicing Astrologers Intensive, which begins this January 2024. Uranian astrology is one of my chief astrological passions because it's through Uranian astrology that I first caught wind of this version of astrology that wasn't as reliant on the signs of the zodiac as we find so much more of astrology occurring within the world at large today. I know that we have many thousands of wonderful astrologers within our community. And I know that people do amazing work in terms of the signs of the zodiac based astrology that they currently do. But if you feel as if you are looking for a new way to grow and evolve and transform your astrological offerings with your clients in general, then by all means check out our website at www.oraculosastrology.com and sign up for our upcoming Uranian Astrology for Practicing Astrologers Intensive today. Now, without further ado, let's dive into our planetary pairs lecture for today, in which I will teach you everything you need to know. And that's not true, really, but I'll teach you most of what you need to know. And that's also not true, but I will teach you the foundations of what you need to know in order to begin looking at every planetary combination with the sun. If you're a person and you have planets in aspect with your sun, then you definitely want to stick around and listen to this entire episode. So before we dive into the planetary pairs with the sun, let's talk about the sun itself. The sun, from a traditional astrological perspective, is the be all and the end all of our cosmic pantheon of gods. And when we read about the sun in traditional astrology texts, we hear these names for the sun arising: Fons Vitae, Fountain of Life; Lux Mundi, Light of the World; Rex Planetarum, King of the Planets. We find this veneration and this love and this admiration and this reverence of the sun everywhere we read within traditional astrological texts. And to a very large degree, the sun is really the core and the crux of so much of what we do from a traditional astrological perspective, especially so much of what we do in terms of Western tropical astrology. Within Western tropical astrology, we know that we divide our zodiac not necessarily based on the position of the fixed zodiacal constellations, but we divide our zodiac based on an even 30-degree segmentation of the sun's orbital path around the Earth from our Earth-based perspective. And we begin that division based on where the sun's orbital path crosses the celestial equator in the east. And we call that point the vernal point, or we call that point the vernal equinox. And from that vernal equinox point, we designate that as 0 degrees Aries, whereas in the constellational zodiac, they designate 0 degrees of the actual constellation of Aries as being the beginning of Aries. and they have an uneven division of the zodiac because the signs of the zodiac aren't evenly divided as our concept of an even 30-degree division of our 360-degree zodiacal belt. So in the constellational zodiac, you have some signs of the zodiac that are very small, and you have some signs of the zodiac that are very large based on the actual size of those constellations. And there are also these massive lacunae, or these massive spaces that exist between constellations of the zodiac, which doesn't give us our clean cut division of the zodiacal sky in the same way as the sidereal zodiac does, or the same way as the tropical zodiac does. A lot of people have this misconception that the constellational zodiac is the same as the sidereal zodiac, and it isn't. The sidereal zodiac uses 0 degrees of the actual constellation of the Ram and then divides the sky into even 30-degree segments. So that's what we find in the sidereal zodiac. We do find this even 30-degree segmentation of space, whereas in the constellational zodiac, there is no 30-degree even segmentation of space. Now, within the tropical zodiac, which I dare say the majority of Western-based astrologers in the world tends to practice based on, we take the ecliptic path of the sun, which is the sun's orbital path around the earth from our earth-based perspective, and we divide that. And that is what we use as our 12 signs of the zodiac. The point of the matter is that from a tropical perspective, we understand, and I don't mean we understand as if other people don't understand it, but from a tropical perspective, we hold this sun-earth relationship with a very deep level of reverence, because there's an understanding within tropical astrology that if it were not for the modulations of the solar power throughout the course of the year, then all life on this earth would cease. So instead of basing our zodiac based on the locations of fixed stars, we base our zodiac based on the turning of the wheel of time of the year, because time and this idea of the year and the seasons that we find being created as a result of the turning of the wheel of the year, these ideas are a lot more personal to us and also a lot more directly impactful on our earth-based life than, comparatively, the relationship between the earth and fixed stars that don't necessarily directly impact us with the same level of dramatic emphasis that the turning of the wheel of the year of time does. So that's kind of my justification for using the tropical zodiac. But the larger point within all of that is that the tropical zodiac is largely based on the sun. It is a solar-based system as opposed to anything else. Now, when we even look at the glyph of the sun independently, the glyph of the sun looks like there is some individual idea that has crystallized itself within the heart of a much larger cosmos. When we look at the glyph of the sun, we see a dot in the center of a circle, whereas the circle, from an ancient Hermetic perspective, represents the undifferentiated unity and the pure feel of chaos out of which all life arises. The dot in the center of the circle that we find in the sun glyph is meant to represent the individuality and the singularity of the concept of I, the individual, I, the person, I, the entity, individualized and in radiant expression from the larger circle within which I find myself. So when we talk about the sun, we're talking about this principle that exists within nature to create individual concepts and individual ideas out of nature that are independent of their relationship to other ideas or other concepts around them. And the reason why this is important is because within the idea and the notion of the sun, we have this notion of what it means to be an individual being within the world, separate and apart from somebody else's individuality. So, this individualizing nature of the sun, this I making nature of the sun, that has the ability to make me me, and that has the ability to allow me to independently and radiantly stand within the power of who I am in direct juxtaposition to who you are. This is the idea that we find manifesting within the sun more than any other idea. This idea of a singularity held within a cosmic field of unity. So, from that perspective, the sun represents this individualizing force in nature. And from a more physical perspective, the sun represents how that idea and how that notion of individuality is carried out within all of us through the physical reality of our physical bodies. So, this is why, from a philosophical perspective, the sun is associated with the physical body. Because the sun, being the carrier of this idea of the individuality and of the individual within the universe, expresses that notion of the individual most specifically through our physical vehicle of our bodies that we all independently have to move within this world in. Whereas you might share breath with somebody else. Whereas you might even share saliva with somebody else. Whereas you might share any part of these transient elements within us with other people around us. There is no way that your physical body will merge or melt into the physical realities of somebody else's body. Even if you're jammed up in the back of an Uber like a tin of sardines, the point of the matter is you will still remain individual beings. And when the Uber door opens, you're going to be able to pull yourself out of that Uber, and the other person will be able to pull themselves out of the Uber. You're not Play Doh, you're not an amorphous mass of jelly that's going to meld into the person on the side of you. And the reason for this is because of the individualizing power that the sun places within all of us. So, the very first idea or concept that we associate with the sun from a planet based perspective and from a perspective of astrology that's more focused on the planets than the signs of the zodiac is this idea of the sun as the physical body. This idea of the sun as the living entity, this idea of the sun as the physical being. Which is why, when we're practicing more planet based approaches to medical astrology, we view the sun as representing the structural and constitutional integrity of the physical body, as opposed to the moon, which represents the soft inner content, the physiological processes, the non tangible processes that occur within this vehicle of a physical body. The sun itself is representing the physical body of each of us, individualized and in radiant expression. So, very often when we're seeing contacts occur with our sun, we're also having a direct description of the physical body within which we move around the world in. Now, beyond the physical body, the sun is also representing men within our lives from a universal perspective. And the first man that we ever interact with within our lives is our father, which is why we can oftentimes use the sun and connections to the sun to be representative of our father within this lifetime. Now, this is a point that I have struggled with astrologically for a very long time. And the reason for that is because in actual applied astrological practice, the moon more readily takes on the role of representing the family in general and the mother specifically, than the sun readily takes on the role of universally always representing our fathers. So, from a traditional perspective, which I know we're not really here to talk about houses, but from a traditional perspective, I'm more inclined to take the ruler of the fourth house as being representative of the father specifically within this lifetime. And if I really were pushing my traditional astrology container of techniques, I would even take the first triplicity ruler of the fourth house cusp as also being able to give me vital information about the father within this lifetime. And finally, as a final consideration, then and only then would I take into account what's occurring to the sun from the perspective of describing the father within this lifetime. As astrologers, something that I teach my students at the Oraculos School of Astrology, and I'm very happy to see that for the most part it seems like something that they get, is that as astrologers, more than practitioners of some magical subject, we are organizers of information. And the most challenging thing that I have observed any astrologer does in the process of presenting a chart at a conference or giving a talk or giving a lecture is this idea of being able to sequentially organize the information of what you're saying to the client or to the conference attendees so that there is a clear understanding of where you've come from and where you're going. And this is something I learned in journalism school because in university, when we're learning how to write for the media and when we're learning how to construct a proper paragraph, one of the things that I learned is that the sentence that came before and the sentence that comes after have to be logically connected to each other based on the sentence that's between them. And very often, when we hear people talking about astrology in the world, there is no logical connection between the ideas they're putting together. It's one random sentence, another random sentence, another random sentence, and you kind of have to find your way through the mishmash. However, if we think about this idea of how to sequence our progression through giving a reading, when it comes to assessing the father specifically within the chart, within my practice, my sequencing is I first of all assess the planet that is the specific ruler of the sign on the fourth house cusp. Then, if I want to gain additional information, I will then take the first triplicity ruler of the fourth house cusp. But that's really pushing it for me because truthfully, I'm quite satisfied 8 times out of 10 to leave whatever I have to say about the father based on the planet that actually rules the fourth house cusp. And finally, third within my sequence, I would take into consideration the sun and what's occurring to the sun in general. Unless, of course, that person has the sun conjunct the south node. Because if a person has the sun conjunct the south node, that more often than not indicates a loss of the paternal presence within their lives, or a loss of the father presence or the father figure within their lives. Because, as you know, if you've listened to me more than once, I consider the South Node to be one of the toilet bowls of the universe. So, if you have the universal significator of your father in the form of the sun conjunct the South Node, that can indicate a diminishment of the paternal presence within your life. And similarly, if you have the ruler of the fourth house in the conjunction with the South Node, that can also represent a diminishment of the paternal presence or of the father within your life. So both of these things stand to be interpreted in the exact same way, which is why I am singling this piece out, the South Node contact with the sun. However, beyond that South Node contact with the sun, my larger idea of sequencing is ruler of the fourth house, first triplicity ruler of the fourth house, and then finally the sun in terms of what I have to say. Now, people often ask the question, well, what happens if you find yourself saying conflicting things about the father based on the sun and based on the ruler of the fourth house? If we find ourselves saying conflicting things about the father based on the sun and based on the ruler of the fourth house, my personal default is to always go with the ruler of the house. Because even though the sun might represent the father universally, the ruler of the fourth house tends to be a far more significant factor in terms of describing the specific relationship that we had to our father and the specific reality of being fathered within this lifetime more clearly, more often than not, than the sun does. Now, that is in a system of astrology where we're using both the sun from a traditional astrological perspective, as well as the houses, and in this example, the ruler of the fourth house as being a specific significator of our father. But what happens when you practice a system of astrology that uses no houses, such as Uranian astrology, which we know in general tends not to use houses? Even though within Uranian astrology we have 6 different house systems, and that's a whole another kettle of fish that we're not going to dive into. But for the most part, people's understanding of what Uranian astrology is that in Uranian astrology we don't use houses. So what do you do then if you're using a system of astrology such as Uranian astrology that doesn't use houses and cosmobiology that don't use houses? How then do we specifically speak about the father? If you're in a system that uses no houses and you're forced to speak about the father, then you're going to be forced to specifically speak about the father based on what's going on with the sun, and only based on what's going on with the sun. And you might say, but Mychal, you just said to us a while ago that usually the sun by itself isn't really going to be descriptive or as descriptive of the father as the ruler of the fourth house. That is true within a more traditional astrological context. But when you switch gears and you enter another astrological context where there is no fourth house to reference, there is no fourth house ruler to reference, but we have the sun and we have this multitude of planetary configurations that can potentially be happening with the sun in this other system of astrology, then yes, most definitely, the sun is going to be the be all and the end all for us as far as our father and our story of being fathered is concerned. So these two things shouldn't confuse us. And as astrologers, we need to know how to exist in the liminal space between two contradictions, because much of what we do, astrologically speaking, is contradictory. For example, traditionally speaking, we speak about the rule of the 10th house as representing our career, but we also speak about the rule of the 10th house as representing our mother. We need to know how to talk about the career vis-a-vis the ruler of the 10th house. And when we're done talking about the career through the rule of the 10th house, we have to know how to take that same planet and specifically talk about our mother within this lifetime. Because as astrologers, we need to be able to put on different lenses when it comes to chart interpretation, because if you get stuck within one mold, you'll die. So that's the realities of the sun and how the sun is showing up for the most part from a traditional as well as from a non-traditional perspective. Now, moving on through the next combination, well, I can't say next combination because there was no combination. I didn't even talk about a combination. I was just talking about the sun. So basically, I was just talking about the sun-sun or the sun-sun midpoint. But now moving on through to the next possible thing to talk about is the sun Aries, or what it means if you have the sun standing on the cardinal axis. Now, within Uranian astrology, we have 6 personal points. We have the midheaven, the sun, the moon, the ascendant, the moon's nodes, and the Aries point. Those are the 6 personal points in Uranian astrology. And we tend not to talk about the south node of the moon. We tend to only speak about the north node of the moon in Uranian astrology, because in Uranian astrology, we only use hard aspects. In a system of astrology where you're only using hard aspects, the reality is that the north node and the south node, or the differentiation between the north node and the south node, becomes a non-factor, because basically we're speaking about both nodes at the same time. So within Uranian astrology, the nodes don't carry the level of interpretive value that they carry within traditional astrology, where we consider the north node to be good and the south node to be bad. We don't have that same narrative existing within Uranian astrology, which within that system of astrology, it's not necessary. However, in traditional astrology, it's highly necessary. And so once again, if we're dancing in the liminal space between two systems of astrology, we have to fully understand those systems completely within themselves, and we have to understand why, from a Uranian perspective or a cosmobiology perspective, the South Node is bearing no significance whatsoever, whereas in traditional astrology, the South Node is thought of as being supremely significant, especially if it is conjunct the cusp of a house or if a planet is in conjunction with that South Node, therefore being afflicted by the South Node. So, those are our 6 points in Uranian astrology: the midheaven, the sun, the moon, the ascendant, the north node, and the Aries point. This Aries point is meant to refer to 0 degrees of all of the cardinal signs and hard aspects to 0 degrees of all of the cardinal signs, to which someone is going to say, Mychal, you idiot. Hard aspects to 0 degrees of all of the cardinal signs will just be from 0 degrees from another cardinal sign. So the square to 0 degrees Aries is going to come from 0 degrees Cancer and 0 degrees Capricorn. But the reality is that when we're talking about a larger field of hard aspects, as we are talking about in Uranian astrology, the hard aspects to 0 degrees of the cardinal signs isn't just going to come from 0 degrees of the cardinal signs. It's going to come from 0 degrees of the cardinal signs, 15 degrees of the fixed signs. It's also going to come from 22.5 degrees of the cardinal signs. It's going to come from 7 degrees and some change of the mutable signs. So the reality is that the 0 degrees of the cardinal signs isn't necessarily as straightforward as we would imagine it to be, because we use a much wider field of hard aspects in Uranian astrology and cosmobiology combined. So the point is, if you have the sun standing on the cardinal axis, the technical definition of that is my body in the world, because the sun gives us the word body and the cardinal axis represents our impersonal connection to the world at large. So the point is that the sun on the Aries point, which is the nickname that we give for 0 degrees of all of the cardinal signs, the sun on the Aries point is going to signify my body in the world at large. Now, WTF does that mean, my body in the world at large? What it means is that if you have the sun on the Aries point, which is 0 degrees of all of the cardinal signs or any of our smaller hard aspects to the cardinal signs, then you are someone who are having a direct impact on the world at large around you. Now, there was a lady who asked, does this mean that my child who has his ascendant at 0 degrees Capricorn, which is him having ascendant on the cardinal axis, does this mean that he is going to impact the world at large? And the answer technically is yes. Now, what does that mean, impact the world at large? That doesn't necessarily mean that he's going to be the president of the United States of America, but what it means is that he is going to be someone who has a lot of connections with his wider environment. He's not going to be someone who is able to stay at home and be a hermit, but his chart is directly plugged into society, because that's what the Aries point represents. It represents society. So when we have our sun standing on the cardinal axis, we are directly plugged into society. We are directly plugged into a lot of the larger mundane astrological patterns that were occurring within the sky on the day that we were born, because we are standing on the cardinal axis. My sun is standing on the cardinal axis, and I dare say that I'm plugged in to society. Well, not society, but I do feel like I have some level of plugged into something. So the point of the matter is, when you have the sun on the cardinal axis, there's no way for you to really not be connected to the wider social structures around you. There is no way for you to just stay home and be left alone. There is no way for you to really step away from society because, to a very large degree, you are a part of society. Now, if that sounds vague, it rightfully sounds vague. And the reason for that is because the sun reflects the things that it is in connection with. The Aries point also reflects things it is in connection with. The midheaven, the moon, the north node, the ascendant, all of these things tend to be reflective of other things that they are in connection with. So Sun Aries doesn't really hold as much of a robust interpretation as Sun Aries plus another planet, or as another planet occupying the Sun Aries midpoint. So Sun Aries is a blank canvas, and we paint it based on the things that are connected to it. Hey everyone, I hope that you're enjoying this episode of the Oraculos Podcast because I sincerely enjoy having you here. So if you haven't already subscribed to the Oraculos Podcast, then just take a moment, use this as a natural pause, and go down below and hit the subscription button so that you can keep your finger on the pulse of the magic and the momentum that we're creating over here on the Oraculos Podcast. I'm so happy to have you here, and I'm so deeply humbled to have you become a part of our community of subscribers over here at Oraculos Astrology. Now, let's get back to the episode. Do enjoy. Moving on, we have the sun midheaven. Now, within our natal charts, the midheaven is representing our soul and psyche. Whereas in traditional astrology, the ascendant represents our soul and psyche. Within a more planet-to-planet based orientation, the midheaven represents our soul and psyche. And this is because the midheaven is a factor of time, whereas our ascendant is a factor of space, because our ascendant is created from the crossing of our local horizon with the ecliptic or the zodiac. Our midheaven is based on our time zone and the exact time and the exact moment of our birth. And from a metaphysical perspective, time is closer to the spiritual substance of who we are than space is. Time is closer to our spiritual nucleus that allows us to live and breathe and have our being. Time is closer to the human soul than location. And as a result of that, the midheaven is thought of as the most personal point from a Uranian astrology perspective. And for those of you who know how to calculate charts by hand using a table of houses, you would know that the first thing we have to find in the table of houses, for the most part, is often the midheaven. And the ascendant becomes a product of the midheaven, as opposed to the midheaven being a product of the ascendant. So when we speak about putting first things first, the midheaven holds a level of primacy or a level of cardinality, a level of importance that not even the ascendant has, because the ascendant is a secondary factor. The midheaven is a primary factor. So sun midheaven has to do with the combination of the body and the soul. The sun being the body, the midheaven being the soul. I personally like to think of the sun midheaven as representing my physical body. We get the word my from the midheaven. We get the concept of physical body from the sun. So I like to think of the sun midheaven as representing my physical body, which is one of the reasons why I look for it from a medical astrology perspective. Now, the sun midheaven could also be used as being representative of my father. The my comes from the midheaven, and the sun gives us the language of father. You might say, so how do we differentiate between that, between the things that are associated with our father and the things that are associated with our physical body? The same way how you look at a planet that is ruling the first house and also ruling a person's 10th house, but you have learned within your astrological practice how to talk about that planet fully through a first house lens, and then talk about that planet fully through a 10th house lens, is the exact same way that we make the distinction between sun midheaven representing my physical body and therefore being indicative of the state of the health within our physical body, and sun midheaven meaning my father. So it's just important to know those two things. If you have the sun in a conjunction with your midheaven, then oftentimes that's something that we see within the charts of people who are highly career oriented or people who are highly goal and ambition driven. So sun conjunct midheaven from any perspective, traditional, Uranian, cosmobiology, sun conjunct midheaven also has to do with the person being fully connected to their goals and ambitions in this lifetime and them wanting to express those goals and ambitions specifically through their vocation. So that can be an indication of a very heavily ambition oriented person or goal oriented person. Now, moving on through to the sun ascendant. The sun ascendant has to do with our physical relationships to the environment. So that can have to do with our physical connections to other people in the environment. That can have to do with our physical environment itself. Sun giving us the word physical, ascendant giving us the word environment. So sun ascendant can also be indicative of the physical environment that we find ourselves coming from, as well as the physical connections that we find being most formative on us within those environments. So if we have Saturn standing on our sun ascendant midpoint, then chances are we came from a cold and depressive physical environment with men who were too strict and people who made us feel as if we weren't worth anything. If we have Neptune standing on our sun ascendant midpoint, then possibly we come from a physical environment that was very disappointing or a physical environment that made us feel as if we weren't safe or secure because we were surrounded by unreliable people and they didn't necessarily give us the greatest sense of knowing who we were or knowing how we were meant to show up within that physical environment. So having planets on the sun ascendant midpoint are more than likely going to be indicative of the sort of physical environment we find ourselves coming from. Now, moving on to one of my favorite midpoints of all time, which is the sun-moon midpoint. Technically, when it comes to midpoint work, we should speak about the faster moving planet first and then the slower moving planet second. So technically, we should be talking about the moon-sun midpoint. But nobody says that. Nobody says that at all. We talk about the sun moon midpoint. And I don't know, maybe the next generation of astrologers will start talking about the moon sun midpoint. But for all intents and purposes, right now, the sun moon midpoint is a very real staple within our astrological language. I know that's even true in terms of the sun with other fast moving planets. For example, we don't talk about the Mercury sun midpoint, we talk about the sun Mercury midpoint. We don't talk about the Venus sun midpoint, we talk about the sun Venus midpoint. So blame the patriarchy, but also it's the sun. So do you really think the sun is going to want to come second? Definitely, positively not. So now we're going to talk about my personal favorite sun contact, which is the sun-moon midpoint. The sun-moon midpoint is a very important midpoint, especially in terms of analyzing love and marriage. And for myself, the only thing I really look at the sun-moon midpoint for is to be a description of somebody's romantic life or of their marriage life in general. When it comes to the discussion of love and romance and marriage and divorce and all of these wonderful things, the sun moon midpoint, you don't want to leave home without it. Because if you have Mercury on the sun moon midpoint, then chances are you're in a very chatty relationship with a very mentally stimulated person, and chances are that person might also be younger than you. Or you probably met that person within an educational capacity. So that could be one example, that you marry someone in an educational capacity, or you marry somebody who you meet when you're a student, or you marry someone who is a student or who's younger than you, or something to that effect. If you have Venus on your sun moon midpoint, you might marry an artist or somebody who's a dancer or a visual or performing artist. You have Mars on your sun moon midpoint, you might marry somebody who's a very martial, hot, fiery person. You might marry someone who's a public defender or somebody who's a police officer. You have Jupiter on your sun moon midpoint, you might marry somebody who's a foreigner, somebody who's from out of town, period. Maybe that person could be wealthy, but the foreign piece tends to stand out more truly. You have Saturn on your sun moon midpoint, you're probably not getting married at all, or you're probably marrying somebody who is substantially older than you, or your marital life seems or it feels stable to the point of sucking all the fun out of your experience of being married. So when we have various planets on our sun moon midpoint, those planets tend to be very descriptive of our marital connections. Neptune on your sun moon midpoint, you're probably marrying a drug dealer or you're marrying a drug dealt. You're probably marrying the person who sells the drugs or the person who uses the drugs. So the point of the matter is that having planets on your sun, moon, midpoints are oftentimes going to be descriptive of your marital life. Now, just because I know people are going to ask me what orb I use a 1 degree orb when it comes to planets that are on the sun, moon, midpoint. And that can either be planets specifically occupying the sun, moon, midpoint, or that can be planets that are in hard aspect to the sun, moon, midpoint. I use a 1 degree orb for the most part. A 30-minute orb would be nicer. A no-minute orb would be the best. Now, when it comes to just regular schmegular traditional astrology hard aspects of the luminaries, hard aspects of the luminaries can oftentimes indicate issues within our paternal home between our parents. So that could be the square between the moon and the sun, or the opposition between the moon and the sun. This is going to definitely be true if, on top of having hard aspects between the luminaries in terms of the square or the opposition, you also have hard aspects between the ruler of the 4th house and the ruler of the 10th house. These things, 9 times out of 10, represent family dysfunction in terms of the parents, and they oftentimes also point towards divorce between our parents. The worst hard aspect relationship that we can have between the moon and the sun isn't actually an aspect at all. And I got a lot of flack from an astrologer about this because in my book, Mastering Traditional Astrology, I wrote something about the quincunx being a hard aspect or something. I didn't even write that because I'm not stupid. I wrote that we, as in me, and my household of Oraculos minions, we interpret the quincunx at the same time when we're interpreting all the other aspects. So we treat it like an aspect just in terms of where we sequence its interpretation. And all hell broke loose because this person thought I was the last idiot on the planet Earth and felt he had to school me and mansplain to me the fact that the quincunx isn't actually an aspect, which I already knew. So the point of the matter is the quincunx is the most challenging and the most difficult of the relationships that could really exist between any two planets, but definitely that can exist between the moon and the sun. That's definitely a divorce signature. And if you are somebody who has the quincunx between the moon and the sun in your birth chart, let us know down below in the comment section whether or not you come from a family of divorce or whether or not you yourself had divorce. And by family of divorce, I don't mean that your uncle divorced from your aunt. I mean your parents divorced or you divorced. Because more often than not, when we have the quincunx between the moon and the sun, as well as hard aspect relationships between the rule of the 4th house and the 10th house, that's very oftentimes indicative of a divorce signature within our lives. Another thing that I don't tell people a lot, but I think it a lot, is that if you have planets standing on your sun moon midpoint, you can also interpret that as being the same or relatively synonymous as those same planets being in hard aspects to your natal Venus. Because from a universal perspective, the hard aspects to our Venus is also going to be indicative of what's going on within the larger field of our love life in general. So, hard aspects to your sun, moon, midpoint are also going to be indicative of what's going on within your life in general if those same planets were in hard aspect to your natal Venus. Now, the sun and the moon from a traditional perspective also represent the eyes. The sun represents the right eye within men, the left eye within women, and the moon represents the right eye within women and the left eye within men. So that's how we interpret the sun and the moon. But in general, they represent the eyes in general. So the opposition of the luminaries, especially if we have the sun and the moon opposing each other in the 6th and the 12th house, can oftentimes indicate weakness of the eyes, especially if we have the sun and the moon in conjunction with the nodes. In other words, if we have a lunar eclipse within our natal charts and the luminaries are conjunct the north and the south node, then that can be indicative of us having weak eyes as well. And the eye that's weaker is going to be the planet that is conjunct the south node. So if you have the sun conjunct the south node, then for men, it will be the right eye that's weaker. For women, it will be the left eye that's weaker. If you have the moon conjunct the south node, for men, it will be the left eye that's weaker. For women, it will be the right eye that's weaker. And there's also a whole spiel about which planet is below the horizon, which planet is above the horizon, because the planet below the horizon is also going to be weaker. But the point of the matter is, if I had to hedge my bets on something, I would go with the planet that's conjunct the south node. Now, the other part of this is that if you have the luminaries in an opposition with each other and you have Neptune conjunct one of them or in a square relationship to that opposition, this is also something we find coming up very often in terms of people who have weak eyes and in terms of people who have cloudy eyes, so people who have glaucoma or cataracts or something to that effect, Neptune is oftentimes implicated within the hard aspect that their luminaries are having with each other. The moral of the story is that the sun and the moon is a powerful combination of planets, and we want to be mindful of some of these things that the sun and the moon mean if they are working together within our chart. Now, moving on to the next combination is the sun and the node, which is the sun and any of the nodes, really. But from a Uranian astrology perspective, you're not going to see the south node. You're just going to see sun north node, period. And the reason for that is because we're just looking at the hard aspects, which means if the sun is making a hard aspect to the north node, it's also going to be making a hard aspect to the south node. So we just talk about sun node. If you have sun node, that represents physical connections in general with others, period. That's what it means. It can also represent that you tend to have more male connections in the world than you do have female connections in the world, and you tend to gravitate more towards men as a source of connection as opposed to women as a source of connection. And this tends to pan out to be relatively true. If you have moon node, it can be that you tend to have more women connections within your life as opposed to men connections, and this also is something that tends to be true as well. So sun node has to do with our male connections, our masculine connections, which is why if you have a planet such as Neptune on your sun node midpoint, it can indicate that you have disappointing masculine connections. You end up with men who smell like water. Basically, they have no character, they have no personality, they're bland. They're like that character from what's that comic strip? Casper Milk Toast. If you haven't looked up Casper Milk Toast, go look up Casper Milk Toast. Those are the sorts of guys you tend to attract into your life. Bland, watery men when you have Neptune on the sun node midpoint. Now, earlier I spoke about the fact that having the sun in conjunction with the south node from a traditional perspective. So whenever I jump back and forth between traditional and Uranian astrology, I always like to make clear when that shift is happening because it's not always evident. So from a traditional perspective, when we have sun conjunct the south node, absence of the father, absence of the husband, weak physical vitality, weak physical body, because clearly sun node, bada boom, bada bing, that's what it means. However, if we have sun conjunct the north node, then that can mean the father was a huge presence within my life. The husband becomes a huge presence within my life. An increase of physical vitality. Once again, we're talking about this from a traditional perspective. Arlene Nymark was a great, wonderful Uranian astrologer. And I was in conversation with Arlene within the last few weeks of her life. One of the things that Arlene said was that within the chart of a woman, for most of her life, while she can take some ownership of the sun will more than likely represent her father. And she said that when she gets married, the sun will go to represent her husband. Now, clearly, Arlene was working within an old school paradigm where women only married men and blah, blah, blah. But the point of the matter is that according to Arlene, within the chart of a heterosexual woman, the sun will represent her. And transits to the sun will impact things specifically happening to her. But the moment she walks down that aisle and says, I do, transits to the sun now become indicative of things occurring within her husband's life. So one of our students at Oraculos said, yes, these men take everything. They even take our sun. And, well, that's what Arlene said. But the point of the matter is, if you are a married woman and you're married to a man, then track and see whether or not the transits to your sun are specifically indicative of things happening to you, or whether or not they're indicative of things happening to your husband. I don't know whether or not the same thing is true if you've had a boyfriend for the last 50 years of your life. And I can't call up Arlene Nymark at this point to ask her what she thinks about that. The point of the matter is, transits to the sun within the chart of a heterosexual woman specifically applies to her and her life, and the minute she gets married, her husband takes her sun away. So there you have it. Now, moving on to Sun Mercury. Sun Mercury, in general, has to do with the body in motion. It also has to do with the young body, the youthful body. When a person has Mercury and the Sun in a conjunction, Abraham ibn Ezra said that it is as if that person has two Mercuries within their chart. And the reason for this is because the Sun is a mirror. The Sun doesn't really have a flavor per se. It does, but it doesn't. And oftentimes the flavor of the sun is simply to make real whatever it is in contact with, or to bring out more of whatever it is in contact with. Mercury kind of operates in the same way. However, Mercury has more of a specific character than the sun does, in terms of us placing a lot more interpretive information onto Mercury. We tend to think of Mercury as having more interpretive things to say. And that's not actually true either, because if you've read my book, Mastering Traditional Astrology, you see that I completely describe what it means for you to be a Solarian type of person versus what it means for you to be a Mercurial person. The point is that Mercury and the Sun in combination can make somebody excessively cerebral, excessively chatty. It can make that person be very good at books and numbers and counting and mathematics and all forms of intellection. It can make that person very verbose, and it can give that person the gift of gab. It gives people the ability to speak and be heard. It gives people the ability to speak and to know that their voices hold value and meaning within the world at large. If you're a Mercury Sun person, then chances are you're someone who's navigating your way through the world around you purely through your mind, and also purely through your ability to talk yourself into situations and to talk your way out of things. There's a very strong connection between the brain and the tongue as far as Sun Mercury people are concerned. Now, since it's such a cerebral combination, sometimes Sun Mercury people struggle to get out of their heads because they can really isolate themselves in a fortress of solitude and overthink themselves and overthink things until they tire themselves out completely. So this is something that we're also finding in terms of Sun Mercury people that we also want to be mindful of. Now, because it has this strong cerebral connotation, when we're Sun Mercury people, we can sometimes overtax our nervous system, and we need to find ways how to offload the nervous tension that we are holding within our lives. So if you're a Sun Mercury person, then let us know down below in the comment section how your Sun Mercury is manifesting within your life and whether or not what I've said thus far is true for you. Sun Mercury can be great in terms of us being problem solvers, but it can also be a little bit challenging in terms of us holding a lot of anxiety and us holding a lot of nervous tension, and thus also holding ourselves in a state of constant hypervigilance and hyper-focusing. So that's something to be mindful of. The negative or more challenging side of the Sun Mercury is that we can be scattered and we could be very irresolute in terms of being able to find a central anchor around which to navigate ourselves in life. So that's something that you also want to know as well. I once heard someone say that Sun Mercury could also have to do with a person having a speech impediment. And because I believe in quoting people, I once heard Lee Lehman say that Sun Mercury can be a person who has a speech impediment. And I believe in quoting people because I believe in giving people their roses while they're still alive. If you believe someone is awesome, you should let them know. So, anyway, Lee Lehman said that being a Sun Mercury person can give you a speech impediment. Clearly, Mercury is having a relationship with the tongue, and the sun is the sun. The sun is kind of malefic in a sense. And so Mercury can never be more than 28 degrees away from the sun, which is why we tend not to really see Mercury that clearly, because Mercury is always going to be very, very close to the sun. You'll only ever see Mercury very close to the horizon. There will never be a night that you look up in the sky and you see Mercury in the sky. It's a virtual impossibility from a geocentric astrological perspective. So a lot of people have Mercury very close to their sun or Mercury conjunct their sun. And another thing with the sun is if the sun is in a hard aspect with something, and in particular, if you have something in your chart that is conjunct the sun, chances are the part of the body that that planet represents is being highlighted. This is something very important to know because in the case of Sun Mercury people, their brain and their nervous system is being highlighted. And by extension, we could say their tongue and the way how they communicate. But also, in terms of Sun Venus people, for example, especially women, Sun Venus could be a combination that specifically highlights the female reproductive system as being someplace within that woman's constitution that she needs to pay far more attention to in general. And the reason for this is something that I'm going to share with you when we start talking about the Sun Venus, which is coming up shortly. So the point of the matter is Sun Mercury points out the person's nervous system and it points out the person's tongue and their speech mechanism in general as being very strongly important and very strongly significant within their charts from a medical astrology perspective. Sun Mercury is also the combination for young boys, whereas Sun Venus is the combination for young girls. Sun Mercury can be a combination of a young boy as well. Moving on to the Sun Venus combination, Sun Venus has to do with harmony, but it also has to do with attraction and attractiveness. It has to do with beauty and thus having an attractive, honey-like sense of beauty that exudes from us through the screen, essentially. So Sun Venus is a very good combination in terms of us knowing how to be personally attractive to others within the world, as well as us knowing how to be waymakers. We know how to smooth the path that exists between two warring factions. We know how to make people come together to have a conversation where they can actually begin to see each other's perspectives. We know how to create a middle ground between others. All of these are wonderful Sun Venus things. If you're a Sun Venus person, you probably are very good in terms of counseling and listening and making people feel heard and loved and cared for and the whole nine yards because Sun Venus tends to work that way. Sun Venus is also a combination that represents attractive men. So if you're somebody who has the Sun Venus conjunction, you're probably married to a very aesthetically pleasing man, or your father was a very aesthetically pleasing man. And if you're a man with a specific combination of Sun Venus within your chart, then you are the epitome of that Bjork song, Venus as a Boy. You know how to look good, you love to look good, and you love to be beautiful, a beautiful expression of manhood in the universe, basically. Venus as a boy, go listen to it. Sun Venus tends to manifest in those ways. If Sun Venus is happening in the sky, Sun conjunct Venus is happening in the sky, a wonderful day to get married. Hopefully, they're not in Scorpio, but from just a planet to planet based perspective, it doesn't matter if they're in Scorpio because a Sun Venus is a Sun Venus is a Sun Venus. So we love Sun Venus. It has to do with personal attraction and magnetism. It has to do with us having a very fine aesthetic sense about what constitutes beauty within the world at large. And that's something that we can express through art, but it's also something that we can express in terms of our human interactions, in terms of us knowing how to create a more beautiful way of people interacting with each other within our immediate sphere of life, which is why Sun Venus is a very good combination for counselors. If you're a Sun Venus person and you're a counselor, let us know down below. Or if you're a Sun Venus person and you're an artist, let us know down below as well. And the Sun Venus also has to do with the womb within women. From a traditional astrology perspective, the sun was thought to be malefic as far as pregnancy is concerned, because the sun was thought to be destructive of the moisture necessary to facilitate pregnancy. So within the chart of a man, Venus conjunct the sun could manifest as a sterility or as having a low sperm count. And within the chart of a woman, Venus conjunct the sun could just point out the female reproductive system in general and the womb in general as being an area where a lot of attention is being focused within her lifetime. So those are two of the ways how that's manifesting. These things are definitely more true if we're speaking about the chart of a woman and we have the Sun-Venus connection in the 6th house, especially if the South Node is involved, especially if Saturn is involved, especially if Neptune is involved, especially if Mars is involved. Whenever we say anything astrologically, we need to make sure that we have multiple corroborating factors, because this notion of soundbite astrology, 3 things to do to improve your sex life if you're a Scorpio. This notion of soundbite astrology, where we launch for the soundbite or we launch for the quick clip that we can use and apply, is an incorrect way to approach astrology. You wouldn't want your doctor to approach your medical care in that way, and in the same way, you wouldn't want your astrologer to just throw out these cheap and dirty things that don't actually specifically lock in to the actual realities within your chart, which is why at the Oraculos School of Astrology, our favorite word is corroboration. If I can't corroborate something at least 5 times, I don't say it, not even once, because I like my personal reputation and I don't like to get things wrong. So when you see me giving a blind chart reading, I'm corroborating my ass off internally so that my words end up striking a chord of truth within the person who I'm giving that reading to. Now, moving on to the Sun-Mars combination. Sun-Mars has to do with the man. Sun-Mars has to do with the macho man. I once had a client who had Venus on her Sun-Mars midpoint, and I said to her, you like the macho man, or you like the Hercules who's going to throw you over his shoulder, or who is that, Tarzan? You like the Tarzanian man. And she said, oh my God, that's exactly what I meant to. Jesus Christ, I love them. And that is her shtick. That is her spiel. She likes the handyman, the rough man, the men who get their hands dirty, the men who, go out in the world and, I don't know, shovel the snow when it snows in winter. Which, if you shovel snow in Boston, you're probably going to be ripped because there's a lot of snow that falls in Boston. So the reality is that the Sun-Mars combination is a wonderful combination. It's a very sexy combination. It's a very libidinous combination. It's the combination of the man who, when you look at him, you get pregnant. So if you're a Sun-Mars guy, then chances are you are action-oriented, independent, competitive. You're somebody with an extra fire within you. You have extra pep within your step. You go to the gym 5 times a week. You love TRX. You love high-intensity interval workouts. You love to be in a state of activity. You're an outdoorsman. You love to go out. you love to adventure, you love to do rock climbing, you have a lot of energy that you want to burn out of your body, you love sex, you're a very sexually active person. If you have Sun Mars, if you're a heterosexual woman with Sun Mars, then this could probably be descriptive of the sort of man that you're attracting into your life specifically, or it could be descriptive of your father. And I guess it could be descriptive of your father no matter what your sexual orientation is. So these things tend to be true about the Sun and Mars in combination. It also represents the violent man. So I think that's also something to be mindful of, that when we have men in our lives represented by the combination of Sun Mars, then sometimes those men don't really know how to hold their liquor, as it were, and they can be violent and aggressive as well. Because when a person is a Martian person, they run the risk of only knowing how to express fiery emotions. And those fiery emotions are joy, happiness, excitement, glee, anger, irritation, all of those things, violence, all of those things exist on the spectrum of fiery emotions, because a Sun Mars person would much rather be angry than depressed, because depression oppresses a person. Depression can oftentimes prevent a person from launching into action, whereas anger at least makes me feel like I see the house that I'm going to burn down as a result of my anger, or I see the thing that I'm going to do as a result of this anger that I feel. Now, once again, this would make sense if that were the only thing you had happening in your chart, just the Sun Mars. But if you have Sun Mars happening and it's also being squared by Neptune, then chances are none of this applies to you at all. If you have Sun Mars in your chart and it's also being squared by Saturn, a lot of this probably does still apply, but you probably don't know how to externalize it or get it out of yourself into the world at large. So you just end up being miserable, a miserable wreck, because you don't know how to move that anger out of you in a way that actually can be expelled from your body. And so you end up getting constipated and you end up getting asthma, because you don't actually know how to move these things out of your body. And so they settle within you and they cause issues, basically. Sun Mars is also indicative of soldiers and policemen and warriors and people who are involved in competitive sports in general. I'm a Sun Mars person, and as a result of me being a Sun Mars person, I want to create competitive astrology. Because that's the sort of stupid thing you want to do if you're a Sun Mars person. You want to find competition in whatever field you are in. So I'm currently thinking about ways how to start the Astrology World Championships, because why not make astrology a sport? We spend so much time doing it, we might as well have some fun competing with each other at it in a series of games that actually tests and shows our astrological muscles to the world. So stay tuned for that, because that's more than likely going to happen, especially now that I've put it out there in the universe. In the past, I didn't really like to appear to be as much of a Sun Mars person as I was and as I am, because I felt as if people would feel as if I have no chill. But the reality is, at this point in my experience, I already think people feel I have no chill, so might as well let people know where it comes from. I'm a Sun Mars person, and you heard it here first. Now, the next combination that we have is the combination of Sun and Jupiter. The Sun has to do with the ability to make something physical, and Jupiter has to do with wealth. Therefore, Sun Jupiter has to do with physical expressions of our wealth. A Sun Jupiter person can be a Santa Claus type person. The person who has Sun Jupiter is somebody who is optimistic and jolly and jovial and wants to have a good time and wants to make sure that people around them are also having a good time. They want to go out of their way in order to support and be of support to others around them. They want for everybody around them to feel as if they have a warm cloud to lay into. They want to be a protector and a benefactor. They want to be a righteous judge. They want to help people find a fair way to navigate indicate their strife and their contentions with each other. Sun Jupiter people are wonderful, wonderful, wonderful people. The problem with the Sun Jupiter person is that the Sun Jupiter person is somebody who wants to make everybody happy to the point of that person overcommitting themselves to everybody around them. The Sun Jupiter person is the person who makes a lot of promises but doesn't necessarily have the ability to always deliver on those promises. The Sun Jupiter person is the person who shoots their arrows in all directions because they are in love with the process of arrow shooting. And hopefully for them, one of those arrows lands in something concrete, but they don't even care about that because they just care about the joy of living in general, that they don't care if the arrow lands in something concrete or not, or if the arrow lands in somebody's forehead. The point of the matter is they just want to feel as if they have the ability to express themselves abundantly in the world at all times, which is a bit of a problem. And the reason why that's a problem is because it can create a wastage of personal energy, and it can also lead to a very real sense of burnout and depletion. Burnout and depletion is something we also find with Sun Mars, but it's of a different nature. The burnout and depletion from the Sun Mars is because the Sun Mars is always engaged in activity, that they can't stop the activity they're engaged in, and so they burn themselves out. The Sun Jupiter person is burnt out and depleted because they're overpromising, overspending, and the activity that they're engaged in is the activity of living life to its fullest, which may never actually include going to the gym. Whereas for the Sun Mars person, the going to the gym piece is absolutely mandatory. For the Sun Jupiter person, the activities that they engage in may never necessarily need to be going to the gym. They could go to the restaurant 10 times a week. And as a result of that, we see this very opulent and richness of life coming through with the Sun Jupiter that we don't necessarily see with the more grungy, rough around the collar Sun Mars. Now, Sun Jupiter has to do with an overwhelming sense of having well being within ourselves, and it's a wonderful combination from a medical astrology perspective because it gives us a great level of recuperative ability. However, Sun Jupiter is also having to do with this notion of wealth being expressed through the size of my belongings, or wealth being expressed through the size of my possessions. And so this is somebody who can run the risk of overspending their personal resources and of making investments that probably don't really make sense in general, especially if the Sun and Jupiter are afflicted within their chart. They could spend a lot, but they may not necessarily be spending from a place of the greatest amount of sobriety. Sun Jupiter, in general, could tend to give somebody a larger body, and that could be larger vertically or larger horizontally. It doesn't matter. Sun Jupiter has to do with the sense of a person having a larger body in general. And this is one of the combinations where we hear people saying, hey, no matter what I do, I can't keep the weight off. It's just a part of my constitution. It's a part of how I'm built. The Sun Jupiter can be a part of that because there's this sense of this excess that we have with the Sun Jupiter that constantly replenishes itself. So if we tell the body, hey, it's time to lose 10 pounds, the body puts on 11 pounds just to make sure that we don't lose the 10 pounds, basically. So that's kind of a Sun Jupiter situation, which is why it's a part of how people can be very, very healthy physically and have a great level of well-being physically, but never need to lose a great amount of weight in order to do that, but still have a sense of overwhelming vitality and health within themselves. So that's the Sun Jupiter combination. Now, moving on to the Sun Saturn combination, Sun Saturn is representing old age and old men in general. Going back to the Sun Jupiter combination, Sun Jupiter can be descriptive of our fathers, or it can be descriptive of our husbands, just because that's kind of what the sun represents. Now, Sun Saturn has to do with the old man, the serious man, the man who doesn't necessarily have a lot of time to shine, the man who doesn't necessarily want to shine, the man who stays in the background because he doesn't believe that he has the ability to shine as brightly as the person on the side of him, the self deprecating man, the man who makes fun of himself so that other people don't make fun of him. All of these are Sun, Saturn types of people. And in general, Sun Saturn can set a person up to feel fundamentally hindered within their lives. And it can also set a person up to feel fundamentally unsupported within their lives, as if they don't have the greatest level of support or security or feelings of goodwill coming from them from their immediate environment, which can cause them to be overly responsible from a very early age. The Sun Saturn person is the person who sees all of the other children stepping on the crack without breaking their mother's back. And the Sun Saturn child goes to the crack and says, ha ha ha, this is just superstitious. Nobody's back is going to break. And as soon as the Sun Saturn person places their big toe on the crack, their mother's back breaks into shambles. And so the Sun Saturn person can have a sense in life as if everybody else can get away with everything else except for them, because there is some vendetta in life that is set up to always keep them on the straight and narrow path, which could be overwhelming. It could be very overwhelming, especially as a child, to have to live under that level of responsibility. But as they grow older, they mature into people who can hold themselves with a great level of gravity and gravitas in general. Now, a part of holding yourself with a great level of gravity and gravitas in general is that it can make you very stiff in your joints, which is a part of why Sun Saturn people, they need to do more Martian activity, whether that's martial arts or Tai Chi. They need to go swimming. Sun Saturn people, more than anyone, is needing to do yoga. Lots and lots and lots of yoga, because remember what I said earlier about the sun in conjunction with any planet, how it amplifies or puts a spotlight on the organs or the systems of the body that that planet is corresponding with. And Saturn is corresponding with the skeletal system, which is a part of why when people have Sun Saturn, it can be something that leads them to having a lot of arthritis or inflammation within their joints. It can also lead them to having osteoporosis or weak and brittle bones, especially if their Sun Saturn combination is in hard aspect with something like Uranus. Sun Saturn Uranus could be thought of as osteoporosis or weak and brittle bones. And so these are things that we want to be mindful of, that when we have Sun Saturn, we do need extra movement. We do need extra yoga. We do need to stay in the yoga pose 30 seconds longer than everybody else, because we are naturally predisposed to having a very tight body. When I lived in, the next thing I'm going to say isn't really politically correct, but let's just see where it goes. When I lived in Cuba at the time, and Cuba being what it is, I'm pretty sure this is probably still the same today. But when I lived in Cuba, I studied dance professionally in Cuba. I started off in Santiago de Cuba, and then I moved to La Habana. I moved to Havana to study at the National School of Dance there. And there was this thread that existed within the dance community of different types of dancers. Now, if you've never been to Cuba before, Cuba is a very blickety black country with a lot of black people. And within the context of that, there's also certain thoughts. And I think within the Caribbean in general, we tend to have certain thoughts about different qualities of blackness, which of course is probably rooted in a long history of something else. But the point of the matter is there's a lot of black people in Cuba. And when it came to black dancers, one of the things that I heard was this idea of there being two types of, oh man, this is an awful thing to say, But one of the things I heard was this idea of there being two types of dancers. You either had the dancers who had the build of, oof, I could feel the cancellation happening after I say this, but whatever. There was this thought that you either had dancers who had the build of somebody who should be working in the field. I'll leave it there. I won't say the other piece, but I'll leave it there. You had the dancers who had the build of someone who needed to be working in the field, and you had the dancers who had the build of somebody who needed to be working in the house, in the mansion, because they had longer lines and more flexibility, whereas the dancers working in the field were the dancers who had the stockier body and the sturdier body that didn't really have a lot of flexibility, but it had a great deal of strength. When you're a Sun Saturn person, you tend to have more of a body that seems predisposed for a particular level of manual labor. You're less of a show pony and more of a cow. You're more of an ox. You're more of someone who plows the field as opposed to being the pretty show pony prancing on the stage. Because there's this greater work orientation that we find within the Sun Saturn that we don't necessarily find within other solar combinations. Now, another thing with the Sun Saturn is that very often when people have Sun Saturn, their father doesn't show up within their lives in the strongest paternal way possibly. So they feel as if they have to father or parent themselves. So that's another thing that is coming up with the Sun Saturn, this feeling of the cold father, the absent father, the old father, separation from the father, separation from men in general, the father being taken away. All of these things we find when a person is having Sun Saturn very strongly within their chart. The last thing I'll say about the Sun Saturn is that very often the child within the family who has Sun Saturn is the child who carries the burden of their family on their shoulders. I've said this before in terms of the eldest child in a family carrying the karmic burden of their family on their shoulders, which is why the chart of the eldest child within the family more specifically shows the family dynamics that occurred within that household more truthfully than possibly even the youngest child. But I will make an addendum to that. And I will say that if the youngest child has Sun Saturn within their charts, whereas the eldest child has Sun Jupiter within their charts, it stands to reason that the youngest child having this burden of the Sun Saturn piece is going to more fully be the one to carry the karmic weight of their family story within their constitution and possibly also within their birth chart, which is a part of why we consider Sun Saturn to be a combination of karmic illnesses or hereditary diseases as well. Sun Saturn. So moving on, the next combination that we have is the electric combination of the Sun and Uranus. Sun Uranus is kind of like Sun Mercury. I, you know, there's a lot of things I think that I can't actually say. And I was going to say something about the Sun. Let me see, what's the nicest way to say it? Sun Uranus is very similar to Sun Mercury, save for the fact that the Sun Uranus is kind of like Sun Mercury on steroids. And by that, I mean that there is this excessive mercurial piece that we see manifesting within the chart of somebody who's a Sun Uranus person that's probably even more excessive than the Sun Mercury people. Sun Uranus people, they are the lightning rod. There's this show called American Horror Story, which I used to love a lot, until it became very, very stupid. And in one of the chapters of American Horror Story called Roanoke, there was this phrase that the villain in the Roanoke Chronicles would say. And she would say that I am the tree and the lightning that strikes it. There is no greater Uranian statement than that. Sun Uranus, I am the tree and the lightning that strikes it. The Sun Uranus person is a person who knows how to be a lightning rod within this world, and they know how to turn themselves into a lightning rod within this world. The Sun Uranus person is a person who is visionary. They see beyond what everybody else sees around them, and they can see the future, which is a part of why we consider Uranus to be a planet of futurity. Whereas Sun Saturn has to do with the past, Sun Uranus has to do with the future. Whereas Sun Saturn has to do with the curses of our ancestors, or, and I say curses because very oftentimes the gifts of our ancestors oftentimes ends up being the burdens of our ancestors that we carry on our shoulders. But whereas the Sun Saturn has to do with the burden of our ancestral story, for better or for worse, Sun Uranus has to do with the ways in which we are planting a new story for our descendants who will come after us. So there's a future orientation that we find within Sun Uranus that we don't really find anywhere else within our other solar connections. The Sun Uranus person is the person who knows how to problem solve and see the solution that might evade everybody else. And the reason why the Sun Uranus person can see the solution that might evade everybody else is because the Sun Uranus person is able to see a new way of solving that problem, whereas everybody else is trying to solve that problem by following the same rules that have existed within the same book since time immemorial. Sun Uranus people are electric and exciting and exuberant and forward thinking, and they speed through life with an electricity about them because they know where they're going, even if they don't necessarily have the clearest path in the front of them. Sun Uranus is a very exciting combination. They are innovators, creators, at the cutting edge of technology, at the cutting edge of everything. Sun Uranus people make amazing astrologers because the Sun Uranus piece is one that knows how to do the electric jumping back and forth between duality and between dichotomy until they find the still point of truth that exists in the middle. Sun Uranus, I can't stop talking about it. Now, the issue with Sun Uranus is that Sun Uranus, since Uranian people use their nervous system to tap into streams of universal awareness that are above and beyond anything that currently exists within this world, these people also suffer from a very specific type of burnout. In the future, maybe I'll do a series on the sun that has to do with the different types of ways how we can burn ourselves out based on our sun. Not our sun sign, but based on our sun. Sun Uranus people represent a different type of burnout because the burnout of the Sun Uranus person is the burnout of being too brilliant. And that might sound like a first world problem, but it's a big, big problem when you bring down so much ideas and thoughts and revolutionary ways of looking at the world around you that you burn yourself out from that brilliance. You shine so brightly that you go kaput, basically. So that's something that we see with Sun Uranus. Another thing that we see with Sun Uranus, and I dare say we see this just as often as we see the Einstein type of Sun Uranus, is the Sun Uranus person who is absolutely frazzled, disheveled, and does not know their big toe from their behind because they are completely strung out, as it were, on a particular wave of consciousness that has completely shattered the container that they have to hold conscious thought. So sometimes people could tap into streams that are so far out and so beyond this world that they completely become shattered because their physical container doesn't have the ability to ground the sort of lightning they're bringing into the world. And these people look like the very embodiment of chaos. You talk to them and it sends your blood pressure up. You see them walking into the room and it makes you want to rip your eyeballs out. You see them walking across the road and it just makes you upset because you see these people and these people just they are it seems as if they are intentionally plugging themselves into the stream of something chaotic where they want to just be anti everything. Anti is another Uranus word. Whereas Saturn represents matter, Uranus could be thought of as representing antimatter. Anti is a completely appropriate Uranus concept where a person just wants to be against the establishment, against the grain, against the mold, against the orthodoxy, against conservatism, against fundamentalism, but not just against those things on principle, but just against those things because they can be against those things, against a particular bill that's being passed, not because the bill is wrong, but just because they want to be the devil's advocate. There is something about that other type of Sun Uranus person where it seems as if they're trying to intentionally be chaotic within the world for no reason. And we call those people a hot mess. A Sun Uranus person who is operating on the lowest end of the Sun Uranus spectrum is a person who is just argumentative for no reason at all, just because they want to be in a state of back and forth. They want for somebody to bounce their electricity off of, but that could be something that ends up isolating them because every time they open their mouth and they say something that turns people off or that rubs them the wrong way. So that's the Sun-Uranus combination. The other type of Sun-Uranus person, the saddest type of Sun-Uranus person, is the person who goes crazy, basically. They have a mental breakdown because they are so overwhelmed by the actual fabric of what they hold within their mind that they don't know how to ground that. And those people need to find help. Those people need to find grounding mechanisms. Those people need to bury their feet in the dirt and allow the earth to do its thing. Those people need grounding. Grounding is the word that should go along with Uranus. Whereas liberation is probably the word that should go with the Sun, grounding is the word that should go with the Uranus, because all three of the Uranian types that I described, they all need grounding. But if you're operating on the higher end of the Uranian spectrum, you ground yourself in terms of the brilliant things that you're creating within the world. Whereas when you're operating on the lower end of the Uranian spectrum, that lightning, it turns inward and it completely destroys the vessel that carries it. And so those people, they find themselves feeling constantly on edge, constantly nervous, constantly filled with anxiety and fear, constantly shaking in their boots, not knowing what to do. And not even because there's something within their environment that fuels that, but because there's something within them that makes them feel as if that is what their approach to life should be. So, three types of Uranian people. All three of these people, it stands to reason, would be very good at astrology. But on that same spectrum of Uranus, you have some people who can be astrologers and do that brilliantly, skillfully, in a visionary, future-oriented way, like the higher level Uranian type can do. And then you have the other type of astrologer who their astrology is an expression of the larger chaos and anxiety that they find within themselves. And I'm not saying this just to pick on astrologers. I'm saying this because Uranian people tend to gravitate towards astrology, and we want to kind of know where we fall on that astrological spectrum so that if we are in the more chaotic side of things, that we find ways and systems to really ground ourselves, because that type of person can easily be shattered by the astrology that they're bringing in, because you're already bringing in revolutionary insight just based on who you are as a person, and then you start to learn astrology, which is a revolutionary subject. Too much excitement is a bad thing. Even if it's positive excitement that's constantly reinforced, too much excitement is a bad thing. And the people who are operating with the Uranus on the more challenging side of things are the people who are constantly stimulated, constantly excited, and it's really wreaking havoc within their lives. I was thinking about this thing that came on TLC once about this lady who has 100 orgasms in a day or something to that effect, where her body, she has a condition that just constantly has her in a state of orgasm. One orgasm a day is nice. Maybe two orgasms a day is great. Three orgasms a day, you might be having the time of your life. But the point at which you're having an orgasm once every minute or once every 5 minutes, it interrupts and it gets in the way of you actually being able to live a normal life. And that was her issue. And there are people in the comment section that said, oh my God, I'd love to have X amount of orgasms a day. But for her, it was actually a medical condition because within her body, there is this Uranian thing that's causing her to be in a constant state of stimulation. And it's literally wreaking havoc on her existence. So if you're a Uranian person, you need to find a way to ground yourself because too much excitement isn't really good for anyone, and it can leave us feeling peregrine. It can leave us feeling as if we don't really know where we're going in the world because we don't really ever know when the world around us is going to change. But maybe it's not the world changing, maybe it's us changing. And as a result of that, we constantly find ourselves in situations where we have no familiarity and we don't feel as if we actually speak the language. And so we always feel like a weirdo or a stranger or a foreigner no matter where we are. Moving on to the Sun-Neptune. Sun-Neptune is a very interesting concept because the Sun and Neptune together are kind of very antithetical of each other. The Sun is representing the ability to make things physical. Neptune is representing the ability to make things disappear. And so you don't necessarily put your tangibilizing power and your invisibilizing and your invisibilizing power in the same room because they constantly cancel each other out. And so Sun and Neptune together isn't really the best. There are other solar combinations that are good. For example, Sun Jupiter, great combination. Sun Mercury, Sun Venus, Sun Moon, great combinations. Sun Mars, amazing combination. Sun Neptune, not the best combination. In the spirit of leading with the positive things first, a Sun Neptune person can be a very wonderful artist. A Sun Neptune person can be a very wonderful creative. A Sun Neptune person could be a very wonderful counselor. You know, when you read books from the early 19th century that wrote on Neptune, they wrote about Neptune as if Neptune were a higher expression of Venus. And I don't know where I stand on that spectrum, but I like the concept of Neptune representing a higher, more rarefied form of Venus. We also see books where people write and say that Uranus is a higher variant of Mercury. I like it. I actually do like it a lot because the longer you practice astrology, I think the longer you start to realize that these things actually do pan out. So Sun Neptune people, awesome artists, awesome entertainers, awesome dancers, awesome painters, people who are very creative, people who have their finger on the pulse of what is creative within society, people who know how to tap into the larger universal zeitgeist around them, and they know how to speak the words that society wants to hear. Sun Neptune people are amazing chameleons. They know how to change and shift shape and become whatever they're needed to be at a given moment. They're very multi-talented people. They're very multifaceted people. Sun Neptune people have a sensitivity that passes all logical understanding. And the sensitivity of Sun Neptune people, it borders on the verge of a psychism or a psychic ability where we find a Sun Neptune person being able to understand the thoughts and the emotions and the moods and the currents that are going on within the lives and the minds of people around them without those people even having to utter a word. Sun Neptune people could make very good spiritual counselors. They can make very good psychic mediums, even though I'm kind of on the fence about mediumship in general as a thing, because I think that I've seen my fair share of fraudulent mediums in my lifetime, and I've experienced firsthand the fraudulality. I've experienced firsthand fraud by mediums, and so I'm kind of ambivalent when it comes to the topic of psychic mediumship and people being able to turn that on and off at will. However, a Sun Neptune person, I would believe that Sun Neptune person if they told me that they could talk to my dead chihuahua. Because a Sun Neptune person probably can talk to your dead chihuahua. on the highest end of the Sun Neptune spectrum. On the lowest end of the Sun Neptune spectrum, they're saying they can talk to your dead chihuahua, but they're lying. Because a Sun Neptune person can also be someone who doesn't always have the clearest sense of reality around them. And granted, there are certain Sun Neptune people within our lives who are liars. If you have Sun Neptune within your chart, your father could have been a liar. Your father could have also been an alcoholic. And resultantly, if you are a heterosexual woman, the husband that you end up marrying could also be reminiscent of your father in terms of either being someone who is duplicitous or a liar or somebody who has an addictive tendency or an addictive pattern that more often than not ends up being alcohol abuse. We oftentimes find partners who struggle with alcoholism when we have the Sun in a square relationship with Neptune, especially within the charts of heterosexual women. And if we have the ruler of our seventh house in the sixth house in the conjunction or in any hard aspects configuration with Neptune, that can also be an indication that our partner is someone who is struggling from an addictive pattern that more often than not ends up being alcoholism. If you have this pattern in your chart and it's shown up within your love life, then let us know down below in the comment section. But the point is, Sun Neptune can manifest as those sorts of people. Sun Neptune can also manifest as people who don't even know that they are in a state of dishonesty or who don't even know that they're in a state of delusion because they don't necessarily have the ability to differentiate clearly between what is fact from what is fantasy. So they keep on going and going and going and creating this storyline for themselves to plug and plant themselves into. And sometimes that's a defense mechanism. Sometimes Sun Neptune people need to create a story for themselves to plug themselves into because they don't know how to live in the world independent of that. For them, the world may be a harsh and a cruel place. The sensitivity that they feel might set them up in such a way, whereas they need to create environments for themselves to feel specifically nurtured because everywhere they go within the world feels like it's surrounding them with layers of broken glass. And they constantly hurt themselves as they try to interact with the world around them. So sometimes people who have Sun Neptune can be very introverted and they can be very self isolation-y type of people. They want to be in the state of self-isolation. They want to cut themselves off from others because their nervous system is so sensitive. Their entire body is so sensitive that if somebody even comes to them who is going to be sick with a cold next week, the Sun Neptune person catches the cold this week that the other person doesn't even already have yet. So there's that other element of Sun Neptune. Sun Neptune is something that we find a lot in the charts of people who have issues within their bodies that are decentralized, that are very difficult to really put a finger on. Sure, it's a combination for allergies. So Sun Neptune people could have very intense allergies in general, whether those are food allergies or otherwise. Even though we tend more so to see food allergies showing up with the Moon Neptune, Sun Neptune people tend to be very allergic to everything as well. Because they have such a porous constitution, everything is leaving its mark on them. So that's one side of the Sun Neptune situation. But another side of the Sun Neptune situation is that they could just feel as if they feel too much, they feel too strongly, and as a result of feeling too much and feeling too strongly, they might want to medicate themselves into a place of numbness or into a place of lack of feeling, because lack of feeling for them makes a lot more sense than keeping their feeling receptors on all of the time, which is a part of why Sun Neptune people make amazing doctors, but it's also a part of why sometimes Sun Neptune people shouldn't be doctors. They shouldn't be therapists. They shouldn't be healers, because very often that sensitivity that makes them know exactly where to place the scalpel without really knowing why they know that. I mean, sure, they know why they know that, but there could also be a psychic extra piece that causes them to know exactly where to put their hand in order to assess what's going on within a person's body. but that oftentimes can be very draining and very taxing and very wearing on their systems in general. So Sun Neptune is a tricky combination. We love it for all of the spiritual things it has to offer us. We love it for the people who have Sun Neptune, who have created amazing works of art within the world. We love it for the ways in which Sun Neptune allows us to step out of ourselves and to step into a much vaster sense of self knowing. We love it, we love it, we love it because the Sun Neptune gives us the ability to decentralize ourselves and to re-centralize the world around us so that we all can see the responsibility that we have to the world around us. The challenge with this for a lot of Sun Neptune people is that in the process of them seeing their responsibility to the world around them, they can oftentimes lose sight of their responsibility to themselves. And when we lose sight of responsibility to ourselves, it actually makes our lives a much more challenging place to live in general. So that's something we want to know about the Sun Neptune. It's a lovely combination for a lot of things, especially things that don't specifically boost our ego, but things that make us feel as if we're giving back to the world at large in a much fuller and a more robust way. But it's also part of what's a problem with the Sun Neptune, because Sun Neptune can create this erosion of our ego consciousness to the point of us no longer existing and to the point of us engaging in activities such as drug abuse, alcohol abuse, any sort of substance abuse, any sort of escapist tendency that causes us to not feel our specific individuality that we've all been blessed with within this lifetime. So these are things that we want to be very mindful of, especially with the Sun-Neptune combination. The last thing I'll say about the Sun-Neptune is that Sun-Neptune oftentimes shows up within the charts of people who have things that are very difficult to pinpoint from a physiological perspective. And some of those things can be so decentralized within them. When you're trying to treat or address those issues, you don't really know where to begin. This is something that I've noticed a lot within the charts of people who have Lyme disease. And Lyme disease is something that we acquire when we get bitten by a particular tick. It was first discovered in Lyme, Connecticut, which is why we call it Lyme disease. It's Lyme disease and not Lyme's disease. And when people have Lyme disease, that has such a global impact on their entire corporature, on their entire bodies, that it's very difficult for them to say what part of them is going to be out of whack today. Am I going to have the brain fog today? Am I going to have the shoulder pain today? Am I going to have the swelling today? Am I going to have the fatigue and the tiredness today? Am I going to have the low pain threshold today? It's so many things that occurs when a person has Lyme disease that it's very difficult to really pinpoint what exactly is going on within their constitution. So that's one of the ways how Sun Neptune can show up, and it's something worth looking at, especially if we have it within our natal chart. Now, if you're a Sun Neptune person and you are the most robust sterling silver expression of health that has ever existed in the universe, then let us know down below in the comment section, and also let us know how this Sun-Neptune combination manifests within your life. Because if you're a Sun in hard aspect relationship with Neptune and you don't have something like Jupiter intervening to change the tides of that Sun-Neptune story, then chances are it's manifesting in a more challenging sort of way, especially if you're a person with a mutable sun and your mutable sun is afflicted by Neptune, which is also an immutable sign. Those things tend to manifest in a distinctly challenging way. So the next thing that we have is the Sun-Pluto combination. At Oraculos, our catchphrase for Pluto is forced initiations. What does that mean? An initiation is something that we go through that's meant to change our lives forever. And when you experience an experience of initiation, the life that you lived before and the life that you lived after are two completely different things, and they have no relationship between them. Because when we become initiated within any sort of initiatic tradition, that could be Yoruba, that could be Lukumi, that could be Santeria, that can be, you could be a part of a coven, you could be dedicating your life to the old gods, who knows? When we become a part of any initiatic tradition, the world that we see completely transforms because the person who is doing the seeing has also been transformed. So that is our catchphrase for the Pluto, forced initiations. The forced part of this is that oftentimes when Pluto is operative within our lives, we don't necessarily feel as if we have the ability to consciously co-create that initiatic experience. It feels as if we're being thrusted over a threshold for which we are not prepared. And that's more than often what happens when we have a very strong and active Pluto, Pluto conjunct the Ascendant, Pluto conjunct the Midheaven. That's the way how Pluto tends to manifest within our charts. When we are Sun Pluto people, the combination of Sun Pluto has to do with physical change, physical growth, physical transformation, physical forced initiations. And Sun Pluto is a very interesting thing that I'm finding it difficult to find the words for because there is a great valley of silence that exists as the bedrock upon which a Sun Pluto person is built. Now, when I say Sun Pluto, and when I say Sun with any planet, you must know at this point that I'm specifically speaking about the hard aspect between the Sun and these planets. So, if you have Sun trine Pluto, I'm not necessarily speaking to you as much as I'm speaking to the person sitting on the side of you who has the Sun conjunct Pluto. And maybe you won't have that person sitting on the side of you because maybe they want to be alone. But the point of the matter is the Sun Pluto person, their lives are built on a bedrock of intense and unbreakable silence. And it's from that bedrock of silence that they do everything within the world. And because there is this strong silence underneath them, everything they do seems and feels and appears much louder than it is. It's as if the rest of us who aren't Sun Pluto people, we operate within the world from a place of there being some level of background noise behind us. So our actions in the world seem to originate from a place of background noise like everybody else. And so, since all of us are doing things from a fundamental level of background noise, our actions tend to go unnoticed, or our actions tend to just meld into the larger melting pot of the human experience. Whereas the Sun Pluto person has no background noise. And that's a very, very, very scary thing for me. And I'm saying that in the most unbiased way possible. But the Sun Pluto person doesn't have any background noise. And as a result of that, their activities within the world at large hit differently. Their activities within the world at large seem to originate from this place of deep silence. So when they strike, the punch hurts more. When they kick, the kick hurts more. When they speak, the word more. When they do things, it comes from a place that seems more stronger, that seems more intense, that seems more powerful, that seems more virile, that seems more potent, that seems more everything. That's one side of the Sun-Pluto spectrum. The other side of the Sun-Pluto spectrum is the person who feels like they can't do anything at all because their entire life feels forcibly smushed by a large oppressive force that exists within the universe that prevents them from feeling any of that previously mentioned greatness. So there are two types of Sun Pluto people in the world. They're the Sun Pluto people who move through the world like a force to be reckoned with. And there are the Sun Pluto people who cannot find any force within themselves because it feels as if that power is inextricably locked within themselves. Which is reminding me of the card, the Eight of Swords, which from an esoteric perspective is called the Lord of Shortened Force. When we have Sun Pluto and we're operating on the heavier side of the Sun Pluto spectrum, say for example we have Sun Pluto and it's being squared by Saturn, those people can oftentimes feel as if they are living their lives in chains and as if they don't necessarily have the ability to break free of those chains because every time they try to do something, they either hear the word no from the world around them or they hear the word no arising from deep within them. And so they can undermine their ability to do anything or achieve anything or attain anything purely based on what's going on within themselves, and also based on the feedback they're getting from their environment around them. Whereas the other type of Sun Pluto person is a person who came into a world that always told them no. And as a result of that, they've demanded themselves to become the most powerful people in the room so that they are now the people who have the ability to say no. If we apply this to the father, it can represent a manipulative father, but really more often than not, it represents a super powerful and overbearing father. Sometimes, because Pluto is also a god who wore a helmet that gave him the gift of invisibility, Sun Pluto can create the invisible father, the father who we knew about all our lives, but we never met him until we were 64 years old. That was the first time in our entire life we met our father. Or we met him once when we were 46 years old, and another time when we were 64 years old, but we only met our father twice within our lives because it feels and it felt as if the concept of being fathered was casted within chains within our lives, which prevented us from actually being able to feel fathered at all. So the Sun Pluto concept is something that can take away our father. But if it isn't taking away our father, what it's oftentimes doing is creating a cruel, manipulative, harmful, vile, violent, awful father. If it's working within that way within our lives. I'm not saying it's going to work that way within everybody's chart who has the Sun Pluto, because the reality is I prefer to take my daddy from my fourth house in general. However, if I take my father from my fourth house and I see that I have my father in my 12th house conjunct the south node, and I also see that I have the Sun Pluto, then chances are I'm going to speak about my father in some of these heavier ways. So, from a paternal perspective, those are the ways that the Sun Pluto can manifest. The overbearing father is one way, the cruel and violent father is another way. The absentee father, who we always knew about but never existed, is another way. The wealthy father could be another way as well. Wealth coming from Pluto and father coming from the sun. So Sun Pluto can also represent a wealthy father. Sun Pluto people, particularly Sun Pluto men and Sun Pluto women, but I think that I'm leaning more in the direction of Sun Pluto men just because from a traditional astrological perspective, the sun is thought to be the giver of life within the chart of a man, and the moon is thought to be the giver of life or the high leg within the chart of a woman. So there is a version of traditional astrology in which we would assess the sun more strongly within the chart of a man than we would the chart of a woman, and we would assess the moon more strongly within the chart of a woman than we would the chart of a man. So, very often, when people have the connection of Sun Pluto, it drives them towards this feeling of needing to attain a sense of immortality. And the immortality that Pluto oftentimes creates is a sense of legacy and the sense of wealth. So, people who have Sun Pluto, they might be people who are working to create a sense of generational wealth within their lifetime, because that is the way that they feel as if they are going to survive the ravages of time. Or they're working on creating something that they could pass on to their children, or they're working on populating the world with their children because they want to create a sense of their own immortality on this earth when they are no more. So Sun Pluto is also something that we see within the charts of people who have amazing, immense amounts of wealth. Sun Pluto, as I'm saying all of this, I'm also realizing that Sun Pluto could also be a very crippling combination for the person who has their sun afflicted in other ways. So if you have the Sun square Neptune and at the same time in a conjunction with Pluto, then chances are you're not tapping into some of these more powerful streams that the Sun Pluto can create, but you might feel very deeply debilitated and weakened within yourself. So, the Sun Pluto can also be an overwhelmingly crippling force within a person's life. And, the word that I think comes with that could be as a result of that person holding so much latent trauma within themselves that they don't necessarily know how to show up within the world and mobilize that power out to themselves towards any greater good or towards any greater aim. So the moral of the story is Sun Pluto is a powerful combination. It's a great combination for manifesting great amounts of wealth. It's a great combination for having a great level of presence within the world at large. It's the great combination for being a great leader within the world at large. People who know how to get into the hearts and the minds of others and who knows how to speak directly into the soul of someone. Those people are Sun Pluto people. They know how to make you feel as if they are you because they know how to speak directly to the core of who you are as a person, even if they're speaking to 1,000 people at the same time. So these are wonderful things as far as the Sun Pluto combination is concerned. Sun Pluto is good for banking, it's good for real estate, it's good for anything that represents generational wealth as well as legacy. As far as the father is concerned, it's good for having a rich father. But there are also some challenging ways in which it can show up as far as the father is concerned. And from the perspective of men within our lives in general, if the Sun Pluto is descriptive of your husband, it can represent all of those things in terms of your husband as well. But what it oftentimes represents more often than not is the husband who is overbearing or who has his hands wrapped around my throat or who is preventing me from growing and evolving in the way that I want to grow and evolve, which might make it feel as if my life is less meaningful or it can make me feel small and depressed under his dominance or under his presence within my life. So all of these things we find within the Sun-Pluto combination. The last thing I'll say about the Sun-Pluto is that a Sun-Pluto person is a survivor. At the end of the day, when this world is completely annihilated, the only sentient beings who will still exist are the rats, because rats survive every natural catastrophe, the roaches, because roaches can survive an atomic bomb, and people who have hard aspects of Sun Pluto within their chart. These people will be the ones to recreate the world. The rats, the roaches, and the Sun Pluto people, because there is a story of survival deeply embedded within them. And they may not even know where that story of survival comes from. It could be rooted in present life trauma. It could be rooted in trauma that was passed down to them across 7 generations. The point of the matter is there's a survival grit that's deeply embedded in those people to the point where no matter what you throw their way, they will rise to fight again. No matter what happens to them, they will always come out as survivors. And their lives might be encroached with experiences that constantly happen to them, that constantly have them having to thrust themselves into this position of being a survivor. And it makes them powerful healers of humanity because the Sun Pluto person knows how to get into the deep, dark places with the rest of us more efficiently and more skillfully than anybody else. Someone once told me that sometimes when someone is in a hole, they don't necessarily need you to pull them out of the hole, but they need you to come down and sit in the hole with them. And there's nobody in your life who has more ability to come down and sit in the hole with you than your Sun, Pluto colleagues, because your Sun Pluto colleagues know how to dwell within a space of darkness and they know how to derive the gifts that darkness brings. There's a quote, I think it's a quote by Mary Oliver, but there's a quote that says, "Someone I loved once gave me a box full of darkness. It took me years to realize that that too was a gift." That is a Sun Pluto quote, if ever I've heard one. So there's this understanding of knowing how to grow through the filth and the muck and the mire and the darkness of life and how to attain a level of survival grit out of all of that, which is a part of why Sun Pluto people have the ability to live forever. And even if they're not living forever in this physical embodiment, there's still something about them that seems as if it will survive the test of time because they have been through everything the world has had to throw their way and they're still standing here. So it's very unlikely that they're going to bow out when they're faced with adversity. So Sun Pluto, a powerful combination. It's a powerful combination that puts people through powerful crucibles of change within their lives. But this is a part of why Sun Pluto people oftentimes rise to the occasion of being extraordinary leaders who define a generation. Thank you so much for joining me once again here on the Oraculos Podcast for another episode of Planetary Pairs. This went on for much longer than I thought it would have, and who knows why that is? Why it is because when speaking about the planets, we have this inexhaustible language with which to describe everything. And we find that we can derive far more interpretive value when we focus our astrology in on the planets than when we focus our astrology in on the signs of the zodiac specifically. So I sincerely hope that you got something from this broadcast. And if you got anything from it at all, please let me know down below in the comment section, because it's nice to know that people are receiving things from this sort of work. And it's also nice to know that people have an appreciation for this sort of planet to planet based work that we specialize in here at the Oraculos School of Astrology. If you aren't currently a subscriber to the Oraculos podcast, please take a moment, go down below, hit the subscription button, as well as hit the notification bell so that you receive notifications of when we come out with these episodes basically on a daily basis. Also, we are currently on a mission to manifest 12,000 subscribers across all of our platforms by the end of November 2023. And we're almost at the end of the month, and we cannot do it without your support. So if you are connected to an astrology community, if you yourself are the leader of an astrology community, then by all means, please share the Oraculos podcast with your community of astrology-minded and astrology-loving friends so that more and more people can know about the source of concrete astrology that we do here on the Oraculos podcast. And as always, if you love the work that we do on the Oraculos podcast, then do sign up for our newsletter, because when you become a part of our Oraculos newsletter community, you get access to so much free content that I have to offer you, and you don't want to miss out on any of it. So please sign up for our newsletter so that you could always stay within the vortex of what's going on over here at the Oraculos School of Astrology. Until next time, I am your host and guide and friend, Mychal Bryan, leaving you in peace and love and hope. Until we meet again, have a good one. Bye-bye.